She never once told me she loved me. And the day I finally understood why, I broke down and cried for an hour. Not a quiet cry, not the kind you wipe away with the back of your hand and keep moving. I mean the kind that comes from somewhere deep, somewhere you didn't even know was bleeding. The kind that empties you out and leaves you sitting on the floor wondering how you misread an entire person for 35 years. But before I get to that day, I need to take you back. Back to a house that smelled like burnt grease and pine sol. That's the first thing I always remembered about home. Not warmth, not laughter, not the sound of music drifting from a radio in the kitchen, just pine sol and silence. That smell was so much a part of my childhood that even now, when I walk past a mopped floor in a grocery store, something in my chest tightens, something remembers. My mother's name was Ruth, and Ruth was not a soft woman. She was not built for softness. She was built the way old houses are built, solid, functional, resistant to weather. She rose every morning at 4:47. I know the exact time because I used to lie awake as a child, counting the seconds after the alarm went off, hoping, just once, that she would hit snooze, that she would stay, that the morning would feel different. She never did. The alarm rang and Ruth moved. That was the law of our house. She ironed in the dark. She cooked in silence. She packed lunches without being asked, without being thanked, without expecting either. Then she left. And the house, already quiet, somehow got quieter without her in it. 12 hours later, she came back smelling like work and exhaustion. She didn't hug us at the door. She didn't ask how our day was with that warm, curious look I saw other mothers give their children. She came in, set her bag down, and moved through us like we were part of the furniture she was responsible for maintaining. She checked our homework. She inspected our shoes, literally picked them up and turned them over, looking for scuffs, looking for signs of carelessness, and then she disappeared behind a closed door. That was Ruth. That was always Ruth. I was 7 years old the first time I told her I loved her. I remember it so clearly it almost hurts. I had drawn her a picture at school, a crayon drawing of our house, the two of us standing in front of it, stick figures holding hands. I ran home that afternoon with it rolled up in my backpack like a treasure map. I handed it to her in the kitchen. She looked at it. She looked at me. And the way she looked at me, it wasn't cruel. It wasn't cold exactly. It was more like the way a carpenter looks at a crooked nail. Assessment. Calculation. Like she was trying to determine what to do with what I had just handed her. Then she set the picture down on the counter, turned back to the stove, and said, "Go wash your hands. Dinner's ready." That was it. No thank you. No this is beautiful. No soft hand on my cheek. Nothing. Just the sound of a spoon hitting the side of a pot and the smell of whatever she was cooking filling the space where her words should have been. I stood there for a moment, 7 years old, waiting for something I couldn't name yet. Then I went and washed my hands. As years passed, I told myself it was just who she was. Some mothers were warm, mine was efficient. Some mothers said, "I love you," the way people say hello. Easily, automatically, without weight. Ruth didn't say it at all. Not on birthdays. Not on Christmas morning. Not when I was sick, and she sat at the edge of my bed in the dark, putting a cold cloth on my forehead. She did the cloth, she never did the words. I grew up convinced something inside her was broken, that somewhere before I arrived, something had dried up in Ruth. Some well that was supposed to hold warmth had simply run empty, and I was the child unlucky enough to come along after. I carried that belief quietly. I didn't talk about it. I didn't perform it for sympathy. I just carried it the way you carry something heavy when there's no one around to help. One slow step at a time, adjusting your grip, pretending it doesn't hurt. It showed up in everything. In the way I flinched when someone said they were proud of me, like the words were too good to be real. In the way I worked twice as hard as everyone around me just to feel half as worthy. In the way I loved people with an intensity that exhausted them, because I was always trying to pour into others what had never been poured into me. In the way every relationship I tried to build had a crack running through the foundation, a crack shaped exactly like Ruth's silence. I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't know that silence can be a language, that some people were never handed the words, so they build things instead, feed people instead, stay instead. I didn't know that the woman I had spent my entire childhood waiting to hear from had been talking to me the whole time, in alarm clocks and inspected shoes and packed lunches and cold cloths in the dark. I wouldn't understand any of that for another 28 years. And by the time I did, I would need every bit of strength she had spent a lifetime quietly building in me just to survive the knowing. By the time I was 15, the distance between Ruth and me had stopped feeling like distance. It felt like geography, like we were two countries that shared a border but spoke completely different languages, traded nothing, and had long ago stopped trying to understand each other's customs. I lived in her house, I ate her food, I slept under her roof, but I did not know her, and the more I grew, the more I understood that she did not intend for me to. Other mothers showed up. That was the thing that kept cutting me, not dramatically, not all at once, just in small moments that added up over years, until the weight of them became unbearable. My friend Marcus had a mother who came to every single one of his track meets. She stood at the finish line with a sign she made herself, his name in big block letters with a hand-drawn lightning bolt beside it. I used to watch her from across the field and feel something I didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't quite jealousy. It was more like grief, like mourning something I had never actually had. Ruth sent a note to my school events, a folded piece of paper handed to a teacher or a coach, explaining she couldn't attend. The notes were always polite, always professional, always signed with her full name, Ruth Elaine Morrison, like she was writing to a stranger. I used to unfold those notes in private, reading them the way you read a letter from someone who owes you an apology but keeps sending updates instead. By graduation, I had stopped expecting her to come undone. I had made my peace, or what I told myself was peace, with the idea that Ruth simply didn't do emotion in public. What I was not prepared for was the handshake. I walked across that stage and found her afterward in the gymnasium, and she shook my hand. Firm, 2 pumps, like a business agreement being finalized. "You finished," she said. "Good, now what?" I stood there in my cap and gown, holding a diploma I had worked 4 years for, and I almost laughed, almost, because the alternative was something I didn't want to do in a gymnasium full of people. The resentment that had been building in me for years had been quiet up until then. I was not a child who acted out. I was not a child who broke things or slammed doors or ran away to make a point. I internalized, I processed, I stored. But storage has a limit, and mine reached it at 17 over something as ordinary as a report card. 3 A's and a B-. By any measure, it was a good card. By my measure, it was evidence, proof that I had done what was expected and then some. I came home that afternoon and set it on the kitchen table, the way you present something you're proud of, even when you've trained yourself not to say so. I watched Ruth pick it up. I watched her eyes move across the grades. I watched her set it back down, and then I watched her walk away. No words, no pause, no acknowledgement, just the sound of her footsteps moving down the hall. Something inside me snapped. Clean and sudden, like a branch that had been bending for years under too much weight finally giving way all at once. "What is wrong with you?" The words came out of me before I could stop them. My voice cracked the silence of that kitchen like a stone thrown through glass. I didn't recognize the sound of myself. I had never spoken to her that way. I had never spoken to anyone that way. But I was 17, and full of everything I had never been allowed to say, and it came out all at once. I work, I try, I do everything right, and you can't even say you're proud of me? Not once? Not ever? What is wrong with you? Ruth stopped walking. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood with her back to me for a moment, just a moment, and in that moment, I felt the full terror of what I had just done. Then she turned, slowly, and her face did something I had never seen it do before. It didn't collapse into hurt. It didn't harden into anger. It went completely still, like a woman standing at the very edge of something she had spent her entire life not falling into. She looked at me for a long time, long enough that I started to feel something shift in my chest, something that might have been regret, or might have been fear, or might have been the beginning of an understanding I wasn't ready for yet. "Pride don't pay rent," she said, quietly, evenly, and walked away. I didn't speak to her for 3 weeks. I ate breakfast early to avoid her. I stayed in my room until I heard her leave. I told myself she was cold. I told myself she was emotionally unavailable, a phrase I had picked up from a magazine and filed away like a diagnosis I'd been waiting to use. I told myself that whatever was missing in Ruth was her fault, her damage, her problem to carry, not mine. I left for college the following year. I packed my boxes in near silence. She didn't offer to help, and I didn't ask her to. The morning I left, she stood at the front door in her housecoat, arms folded across her chest, watching me load the last of my things into my friend's car. The morning was gray and cool. Neither of us said much. When I climbed into the passenger seat, I told myself I wouldn't look back, and I didn't. I didn't know she stood in that doorway long after the car turned the corner. I didn't know she went back inside and sat down on the porch steps in the quiet and cried in a way I had never once seen her cry. I didn't know any of that yet. I wouldn't know it for another 17 years. And when I finally found out, it would rearrange everything I thought I understood about the woman who raised me. I was 34 years old when my aunt called. It was a Tuesday. I remember, because I had just gotten home from a long day and had barely set my keys down, when my phone rang. She didn't drag it out. My aunt was a woman who delivered news the way Ruth did most things. Straight, with no extra wrapping. Ruth had suffered a stroke. Minor, she said, but alarming. The kind that reminds you that time is not as patient as you've been pretending it is. I booked a flight that same night. Walking back into that house after so many years felt like stepping inside a memory that hadn't finished yet. It still smelled like pine sol. The furniture was in the same places. The same curtains filtered the same thin morning light through the same windows. Time had moved everywhere else in my life. In that house, it seemed to have simply waited. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment and felt 15 years old again, full of all that old hunger, all that old unanswered longing, before I reminded myself why I had come. Ruth in a hospital bed was the second great shock of my life. The first had been realizing I was angry at her. This was different. This was worse in a quieter way. She had always taken up space the way monuments take up space, not aggressively, but absolutely. You simply could not ignore her presence. She made rooms feel smaller just by being in them. But lying in that hospital bed with monitors beeping softly around her, she looked like paper, thin and pale, and somehow folded in on herself, fragile in a way the word fragile had never applied to Ruth before. I sat beside her and didn't know what to say. That was nothing new between us, but it felt heavier now. We had accumulated so many years of silence that conversation felt like trespassing, like trying to walk across land that had been closed off so long the path had completely grown over. She was awake. Her eyes found me when I walked in, and something moved in them, something I couldn't fully read, which was also nothing new. We sat together for a while without speaking. The monitors kept their rhythm. Somewhere down the hall a door opened and closed. Then she moved her hand, slowly, deliberately, the way she did everything. She pointed to her bag on the chair beside the bed. "Inside pocket," she whispered. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. Not weak exactly, just reduced, like a fire that had burned down to its most essential heat. I reached into the bag. My hand found an envelope before my eyes did. I pulled it out and looked at it. It was old. The paper had gone soft at the edges from being handled, held and set down and held again, many times, over many years. My name was written on the front, in her handwriting, the same handwriting from all those folded notes sent to teachers and coaches over the years. Except this time it wasn't signed with her full name like a letter to a stranger. This time it just said, "My son." "Not yet," Ruth said. Her eyes were steady on mine. "When I'm gone." I wanted to ask her what was inside. I wanted to open it right there, in that room, with her watching. But something in her face told me that wasn't how this worked. This was Ruth. Everything on her terms. Everything in its time. I folded the envelope carefully and put it in my jacket pocket, close to my chest, where I kept things I was afraid to lose. She didn't die. The doctor said she was stable and that with rest and care she would recover well. I stayed for 4 days, sitting beside her, fetching things, speaking to nurses, doing the practical work of being present, because that was what I knew how to do, what she had taught me to do. On the last evening before I flew home, I sat beside her bed in the dim light and watched her sleep. She looked peaceful in a way I had rarely seen her look while awake, like whatever she carried when she was conscious had been allowed to set itself down for a while. 3 weeks later, back in my own apartment, I opened the letter. I sat down at my kitchen table with a glass of water I never touched and a stillness around me that felt like the whole world had agreed to be quiet for a moment. I unfolded the pages slowly. There were 3 of them, front and back, her handwriting, small and careful, filling every line. And I broke. Not gently, not gradually, all at once, the way a structure breaks, when the last thing holding it gives way. I sat at that table and sobbed in a way I had not sobbed since I was a child, maybe not even then, because inside those 3 pages was 35 years of everything Ruth had never said out loud, everything she had carried in silence while I was busy deciding she felt nothing. She wrote about her own mother, a woman I had only known through old photographs, and the way Ruth's jaw tightened whenever her name came up. She wrote about growing up in a house where love was not spoken, where softness was treated like a weakness that would get you hurt, where saying, "I love you," was seen as leaving a door open for the world to walk through and take something from you. Her mother had not been cruel, she wrote. She had simply been formed by women who were formed by women who had learned to survive by closing off the parts of themselves that could be wounded. And she had passed that formation on the only way she knew how, completely, and without realizing it was something that could be changed. She wrote, "I didn't know how to say it. I tried sometimes, in the dark, when you were sleeping. I stood in your doorway and said it to you then. But in the light, with your eyes open, I didn't know how. What I did know was how to make sure you would survive without it. I made you strong. I made you ready. I made sure that whatever the world did to you, you would not break. That was the only love I knew how to give. I hope one day you understand that it was still love." She wrote about the morning I left for college, about standing in that doorway long after the car turned the corner, about going back inside and sitting on the porch steps in the cool gray morning and crying until her chest hurt, about how she had written this letter that same afternoon, in the silence of a house that suddenly had one less person in it, and had been carrying it ever since, waiting for the right moment, which kept not coming, until a Tuesday stroke made her realize the right moment had always been now. I sat at that table for a long time after I finished reading. The water in my glass went warm, the light in the room shifted as the afternoon moved toward evening, and slowly, something that had been clenched inside me for 35 years began, quietly and painfully, to open. Ruth had loved me in the only language she had ever been taught, and I had spent 34 years calling that language silence. I had been wrong. I had been so completely, heartbreakingly wrong. I drove back to see her the following weekend. I didn't bring the letter. There was no need. Every word of it had already settled into me like rain into dry ground. Slow, deep, permanent. I had read it so many times by then that I could have recited it from memory. But that wasn't why I was going back. I was going back because for the first time in 35 years, I understood something. And understanding something that large, that overdue, is not the kind of thing you carry alone. She was home by then, moving carefully through her house, the way people move after their body has issued them a warning they can't ignore. Slower, more deliberate, like she was finally paying attention to the cost of things. I found her in the kitchen. Where else would Ruth be? Standing at the stove with her back to the door. She heard me come in. She didn't turn around immediately. That was Ruth too. Always finishing what she started before she gave you her attention. A small thing. A thing I used to read as indifference. Now I watched it and saw something different. I saw a woman who had taught herself to complete things, because in her life, incompletion had always meant loss. She turned when she was ready. She looked at me the way she had always looked at me, steady, assessing, giving nothing away on the surface. But I was looking at her differently now. I was looking at her the way you look at something you almost lost before you understood what it was. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table, the one where she had set down a report card 18 years ago and walked away without a word, and I had shattered the silence of our house with all my unanswered need. The table had not changed. The kitchen had not changed. But the 2 people sitting at it were different in a way that mattered more than I had words for yet. I read it, I said. 2 words. They were enough. She nodded once. She didn't ask which parts I had read, or what I thought, or how I felt. She didn't explain or justify or add anything. She just nodded. And in that nod was something I recognized now. The same compression she applied to everything. A whole world of feeling reduced to the smallest possible gesture. A language I had spent a lifetime misreading as coldness when it was actually just density. She felt things deeply. She always had. She simply had never been given the tools to spread them out. "I know you loved me," I said. My voice held, but only barely. "I know now." Something moved behind her eyes. That tide again. That quiet, enormous shift I had seen in the hospital room. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. That was all. No words, no explanation, no apology offered, and none expected. Just her hand. Warm and dry, and steady in the way that only hands that have worked for decades can be steady. The hand that had made my lunches, and ironed my shirts, and held cold cloths to my forehead at 2 a.m., and written 3 pages of everything she couldn't say to my face. I looked down at her hand on mine, and I felt something release in my chest. Something that had been held tight for so long, I had stopped noticing the tension of it. Like a fist slowly opening. Like a breath finally let go. We sat like that for a while. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. We had wasted enough words between us over the years. Or rather, enough silence. And this was different. This silence was not empty. This silence was full. It had weight and texture and meaning. It was the silence of 2 people who had finally stopped standing on opposite sides of a wall and were simply standing together in the same space, breathing the same air, for maybe the first time. I thought about everything I had carried because of her. All the years I had walked through the world with that hollow place inside me, the place where "I love you" was supposed to live and never did. I thought about the relationships I had damaged with my unspoken hunger, the way I had always needed more than people could give, because I had always been running a deficit that started before I was old enough to understand deficits. I thought about the therapy I had done in my late 20s, sitting across from a woman who kept asking me about my mother, and how I had described Ruth in such precise terms, emotionally unavailable, avoidant, incapable of intimacy, and felt righteous about every word. I had been telling the truth about what I experienced, but I had not been telling the whole truth about who she was. Those are 2 different things, and the distance between them is where most of the damage in the world gets done. My mother had not withheld love. She had given me every ounce of it she possessed. In 4:47 a.m., alarms and inspected shoes and packed lunches, and cold cloths in the dark, and firm handshakes at graduations, and a letter she had carried for 17 years, waiting for the courage or the occasion to deliver it. She had given me all of it in the only language she had ever been taught, a language built not from words but from action, from showing up, from making sure, from staying, even when staying meant staying silent. She loved me in the language of preparation, of endurance, of making sure that whatever I faced in this world, I would face it upright. She didn't hold my hand through hard things, because she was training me not to need a hand to hold. She didn't tell me she was proud of me, because she was teaching me to be proud of myself, to need that validation from inside, not from her, not from anyone. She made herself into a wall so that I would learn how to climb. I understand now that not everyone who loves you will love you in a way that feels like love. Some people love you in ways that look like distance, in ways that feel, for years, like absence, in ways that leave marks on you that take decades to understand. An understanding, real understanding, the kind that settles into your bones. That takes time. It takes loss. It takes a letter in an inside pocket and an old woman's hand on a kitchen table, and a long, quiet moment of finally seeing someone not as you needed them to be, but as they actually were. The hardest lesson my mother ever taught me was not about love. It was about looking deeper than the surface of the people who built you, and asking not just, why didn't they give me what I needed, but what were they carrying when they raised me, and did they survive it? It was about understanding that the people who seem the coldest are sometimes the ones who burn themselves completely out keeping you warm, and never once told you what it cost them. Some people love loudly. They fill rooms with it. They say it easily, often, like breathing. Some people love quietly, in the space between the things they do and the things they can't bring themselves to say. And some people love you in ways you won't understand until you're 35 years old, sitting at a kitchen table that smells like pine sol, holding a hand that was always holding yours, even when you couldn't feel it. That was Ruth. That was always Ruth. And the lesson she left me with, the one I will carry for the rest of my life, is this. Before you decide someone doesn't love you, make sure you understand the language they're speaking. Because love doesn't always sound like love. Sometimes it sounds like an alarm at 4:47 in the morning. Sometimes it sounds like silence. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, if you live long enough, if you're willing to look, it sounds exactly like the truth. Thank you for watching Scars and Seasons, where every scar has a season and every season has a lesson. Subscribe and stay close. The next story is already waiting.